our program and to join another edition of Working for You.
Today begins the Atlantic hurricane season. And today our program will be about disaster preparedness. We are going to look at the role of our major institution with disaster management, responsible for disaster management. That is the National Emergency Management Agency. And then we are going to look at some of the forecast for the 2022 Atlantic hurricane season. I have here in studio with me Mrs. Ulrika Lennon-Petty, and she is the planning officer at the National Emergency Management Agency, what we call NEMA. And additionally, I have Mr. Elmo Burke, and Mr. Elmo Burke is the Senior Met Officer at the St. Christopher Air and Seaports Authority, what we know as SCASPA. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Right, so it is that time of year again. You know, it's something that we have come to know in the Caribbean. We lie in the path of hurricanes. And while we can do nothing to prevent them, we can do so much in terms of preparing for them, and so that we can mitigate the impact of the destructive nature of hurricanes. So I want to start with Mr. Elmo Burke, our Met Officer. And I want him to give us some of the facts, the fast facts of the 2022 Atlantic hurricane season.
Thanks, Mr. Williams. I would first like to start off introducing the official forecast for this year. According to the Colorado State University, we are anticipating about 19 storms, 9 of which may develop into hurricanes, and out of those 9, we are anticipating 4 of those may develop into major hurricanes. And when we say major hurricanes, we are speaking about hurricanes reaching categories 3, 4, and 5. And just to backtrack a bit, I just want to mention that the official hurricane season runs from June the 1st to November 30th. However, we recognize that there's always a potential that you can have systems starting forming prior to June 1st, and you can also have systems lasting beyond November 30th. For this year, we would have recognized that quite a few tropical waves would have come off the eastern African coast. Some of those would have traversed across the Atlantic. Fortunately for us, none of those would have developed into any cyclone. However, on the Pacific side, we are now monitoring what would have been the first Pacific hurricane for this year, and that would have traversed in an eastward direction, moving across Mexico. Based on that trajectory, it's expected to enter over into the Atlantic basin as a depreciated system. And when I say depreciated system, I'm talking about something that is no longer a tropical cyclone. After that, it is anticipated that it's expected to regenerate, and as such, we are anticipating it to become our first Atlantic system for this year. And the name for that would be Alex. So once it forms into a tropical depression or tropical cyclone, it will be given the name Alex. And that's it for now.
Right. Mr. Burke, tell us, okay, this might be a very simple question, but nonetheless one that many people perhaps do not know. What is a hurricane?
The simple definition for a hurricane is a tropical cyclone with winds 74 miles per hour and greater. So once we attain 74 miles per hour sustained winds, we classify it as a hurricane. A tropical storm is winds ranging from 39 to 73 miles per hour. And you can have a tropical depression that is not fully formed. Once you have winds less than 39 miles per hour, that is when we have a tropical depression.
So the hurricanes are ranked based on the intensity of the sustained winds.
Yes, please. Also, when we're talking about categories 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, this also correlates with potential damage. So, for example, when we're talking about a category 1 storm or category 1 hurricane, we're talking about minimal structural damage. Whereas when we're talking about a category 5 hurricane, we're talking about catastrophic damage.
Right. So you have scales of 1 to 5.
Yes, please.
In terms of the intensity, and the Saffir-Simpson hurricane wind scale. That is how they are ranked on that scale.
Yes, they are.
Mm-hmm. Right. So why at this time that we enter into the hurricane season? What are the conditions at this time from June 1st to November 30th that make it opportune for hurricanes to perform?
There are several factors. When you look at in terms of where most of these systems would generate, you start to see a warming of the ocean currents. So you find the oceans are getting warmer across the equatorial area, and as such, that is the fuel for these systems. You also have, once they are away from the equator, you have the propensity for them to allow for spinning. Unfortunately for us, for this year, we are in a La Nina year. And when I say a La Nina year, we're talking about an abnormal cooling of the eastern central Pacific. And because of that cooling, the net effect for us here in the Atlantic Ocean is weaker upper level winds. These weaker upper level winds allow for tropical cyclone to potentially develop. So whatever systems come across, because you don't have the strong winds aloft to tear them apart, you have the chance for them to develop into a mature system.
Right. So tell me, Mr. Burke, we hear about a hurricane warning, a hurricane watch, and things like that. Tell me a little bit more about that. When do you say it's a hurricane watch? When do you say it's a hurricane warning?
Okay, thanks, Mr. Williams. What we do when we issue any watch, whether it be a tropical storm or a hurricane watch, those are issued 48 hours in advance of possible impact from a tropical cyclone. However, when we're now moving into the warning stage, in terms of a tropical storm warning or a hurricane warning, what we are anticipating at the time is tropical storm conditions are expected within 36 hours. So you recognize the difference between the watch and the warning. With the watch, conditions are possible within 48 hours, so you have a longer duration to prepare, whereas when you know into the warning stage, you have a shortened period and conditions are expected. So the level of certainty has increased as well as the time of impact has decreased. And that is for both tropical storm as well as hurricane.
Right, so what would be considered a major hurricane?
Would be once you have sustained winds of 110 miles per hour or greater.
Okay. And so therefore, the greater the intensity is really the greater the chances of damage being done.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, please.
Right. Okay. We're going to look a little bit more at the predictions later on and some of the names of the storms for this season. But let me move to Mrs. Petty. Mrs. Petty, NEMA, or the National Emergency Management Agency, plays a key role in terms of comprehensive disaster management. Some people think it is only about hurricanes, but it is not just about hurricanes. As in the Caribbean, of course, we suffer more disasters than just hurricanes. We can have volcanic eruptions, we can have tsunamis, we can have earthquakes and other storms. And some of them are natural, and others are, we can have humanitarian crisis that comes about because of the natural disasters. And we can also have some disasters that are man-made, of course. So tell us a little bit in terms of NEMA's role in comprehensive disaster management.
So as you mentioned before, persons along the years have had the idea that NEMA is a hurricane-centric agency. In fact, when I started at NEMA, persons told me, oh, okay, so the first half of the year you'll be relaxed, and then coming down to the latter half is when you'll be in action. But that is completely untrue. We look at comprehensive disaster management, which means that any potential hazard, man-made or natural, that could potentially impact the lives and livelihoods of citizens and residents of St. Kitts and Nevis, we keep an eye on them, and we monitor them closely. We monitor seismic hazards, the volcanic hazards, earthquake. We also monitor hurricanes, of course. Drought is one of them. You know, the slow onset hazard that creeps up on you. And currently we are in a drought period, if you recognize. We also monitor fires, as well as landslides, anything, flash floods, storm surge, anything that could potentially impact the lives and livelihoods of citizens or residents, we monitor it.
Right, so you mentioned two key words there, excuse me, lives and livelihoods. And that is something that we have been hearing a lot of, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, protecting lives and livelihoods, and a life-first strategy. Because without life, you can't talk about livelihood, although a livelihood supports life. You know, a livelihood supports life. Because if you don't have a livelihood, then it simply means that the quality of your life is diminished, and most likely it will be obliterated. So livelihood is also important. So those strategies, life and livelihood, two key words, of course, in terms of managing the disasters. So tell us, Ms. Petty, how does NEMA work? How does NEMA work in terms of the management of disasters? So one thing, this is what the agency does, but the agency must have some strategy in place, some sort of a organizational chart or something, you know, to achieve its objectives.
So during peacetime, which we classify peacetime as when we don't have a potential impact or when we've not been impacted, we serve as the secretariat. We do our administrative duties, which include ensuring that our 10 national disaster subcommittees remain ready and prepared for any eventuality. We also, of course, monitor any man-made or natural hazard. And then when it comes to potential impact or after an impact or during an impact, we activate and we move from being the secretariat, we move from being that, and once activated, we activate the National Emergency Operations Center, which is, of course, located at our headquarters, and then we move into action. So NEMA serves as a secretariat to the Mitigation Council. The Mitigation Council is headed by design, the Prime Minister, who, however, usually delegates the task, and he has delegated it to the Attorney General, Honorable Vincent Byron Jr., as well as Honorable Wendy Phipps, who is the co-chair of the Mitigation Council. On the Mitigation Council, we have decision makers because, during emergencies, you don't want to have persons sitting there that would have to ask a question. You want persons who are able to say on the go that this has been approved and this is what we're going to do. And so we have decision makers on the Mitigation Council, on the National Disaster Subcommittees, as well as sitting in the National Emergency Operations Center. These are made up, of course, of permanent secretaries of the different ministries as well as heads of departments. And so these serve as both for the Mitigation Council, because some of them do play a double role for terms of they sit on the Mitigation Council, but they also have a role to play in being a National Disaster Chair or a member of the National Emergency Operations Center.
Right. You keep using that word, mitigation. Mitigation. Could you tell me what you mean? I don't know, I'm playing dunce. What you mean by mitigation?
Okay, so before I explain mitigation, when I mentioned that NEMA is the secretariat, and during peacetime, this is how we function. We function around the disaster management cycle, which is mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery. So mitigation would be any action taken to either reduce the impact or eliminate the impact of a potential hazard. For example, some mitigative measures that would have been taken around the island. You have the old road bay. Once the sea is rough, you have the potential of storm surge coming up on the road and potentially impacting lives, as well as you had the potential of rock slides or landslides on the next side. And so that was a mitigative measure that they put in place to protect the lives of persons who would traverse along that area. Another example of a mitigative measure is wash gut in Keon. Once before, when that gut is running, you would have not been able to pass as it interacted with a main roadway. However, now that they've built the bridge, that eliminates that threat where once the gut is running, it runs under the bridge as opposed to over it. And so now you have the protection of lives. And so those are just some examples of mitigation. Another example would be early warning systems. For example, the flood gauge monitoring system at St. Peter's, as well as the different seismic monitoring sensors that are placed around the island. And then we move to preparedness. Preparedness, we are currently in a preparedness phase, the start of the hurricane season. And so we preach preparedness, always be prepared, any action that would assist you during impact. You check your homes, you prepare your go kits, you make sure that you have adequate supply, you make sure that your business as well is ready, because you don't just look at your home, but you look at your livelihood, because as I said, we try to protect lives and livelihood. And then, of course, the response phase, I think that one is self-explanatory. Something has impacted you, so whatever actions taken in the mitigation and preparedness stage, this is when you see the benefits of those actions during response phase. And for NEMA, response looks like activating the National Emergency Operations Center and having the stakeholders there in one room to manage whatever hazard that would have impacted St. Kitts and Nevis. And then you have recovery, because after an impact, the most important thing to do is recover. You return to normalcy as quick as possible. And in the recovery phase, one thing that persons don't realize is that recovery depends on how prepared you are. And that's why we preach preparedness, that's why we preach mitigation. Because if you are prepared, if you have the necessary things in place, then it makes your recovery even smoother.
Right, so when we're talking about the disaster management, we are talking about before the disaster preparation, you're talking about during the disaster and after the disaster, as you spoke about the whole recovery phase. But perhaps the one that is most important, they're all important phases, but the one that is most important is the before, because the preparation will determine the impact and also will affect the recovery. Right, so that is the thing. Now, how should people prepare? What are some of the vital things that people should do to prepare for a storm?
In terms of preparedness, we'll touch on family and home, and then we'll move to business. So we always preach that it's good to have a family emergency plan. Basically, it's a plan of what would you do in the event of, and that would speak to before, during, and of course after, as you mentioned before. You assign different roles to different family members. Okay, you're responsible for collecting the water, you're responsible for making sure that we have adequate food supply. It's also important that you keep on hand a stock of non-perishable food items. Non-perishable food items meaning canned food or dried goods, food that you know that if you lose power, they will not go bad. And we encourage that you have enough to last at least 3 days, and that's per family member, because you will be looking at it per household, especially if you are considering going into an emergency shelter. And then we do this, you do the same with water. You have 1 gallon of water per day per person within your household. And that speaks to the item side. You know, you also make sure that you have your first aid kit. We encourage persons to always have a go bag just in case you have to evacuate on a moment's notice, so that once you realize that you're being impacted in such a way that you cannot stay where you are, you may have to go to an emergency shelter. You don't have to take the time and pack a bag. You already have packed this bag, and this bag would include, you know, your food items, water, a change of clothes, medication, important documents. Of course, you make sure that these important documents are in a sealed, waterproof container. Maybe you can use a Ziploc bag. You also make sure that any prescription medication that you know that you cannot go without, that you have adequate supply of those. After an impact, you do not know how long it may take you to get those medications. So even though, for example, if you're hypertensive, you make sure that you have your medication, and that you make sure you have an adequate backup supply. You also make sure that you have batteries for your flashlights, a transistor radio or a portable radio, because communication is one of the things after power that goes down. So you have to make sure that you have a way to keep in touch, to keep abreast of what's happening out there.
Right.
And sorry. And then, of course, you also check the integrity of your house. You go around, you check your windows, your shutters, your roofs. You also make sure that there isn't anything in your yard that can potentially become a missile during high winds. As Elmo mentioned, during a hurricane, wind speed increases, and with the increase of wind speed is the potential that the wind can pick up any heavy object and move it around, and it can potentially either damage your home or the property of others. And then you look at the trees as well in your yard, make sure that they don't interact with wires or potentially have the potential to impact your home or the homes of others.
So we want to reduce risk, of course, and preparedness would play an important role in building the resilience of communities. So, of course, we know that the government, as in the agency, has a role to play in helping people to prepare. But preparedness is a communal responsibility, it's a responsibility of the community, and it's a personal responsibility as well. So the government alone can't do it, and the government agency alone can't do it. But people in their communities must be aware of their surroundings, aware that we are in this particular time, which is the hurricane season, and that they must start to prepare now.
Well, they should have already started preparing, because we are now in the hurricane season. But hopefully, if they have not done so, that they will start doing so today.
Right. And we know, Ms. Petty, that there are a number of factors that are now giving rise to more severe storms and disasters. One of them is climate change. We hear a lot about climate change, how our climate is actually changing. And so the disasters are becoming more impactful. And that is something that we have to take into consideration as well. Now, Elmo, what areas, when we speak about hurricanes, Atlantic hurricane season, what areas does it cover?
When we're talking about the Atlantic hurricane season, we are talking about from the western African coastline all the way across, traversing the entire Atlantic Ocean basin into the Caribbean Sea, over to the coastal U.S. borders. So it's the whole swath we're talking about. So once you have
about the Gulf of Mexico.
the Gulf of Mexico inclusive.
Okay, so the Gulf of Mexico, the Atlantic Ocean, and the Caribbean Sea.
Yes, please.
Okay. So those islands and countries that find themselves in that geographic location are vulnerable to being impacted by hurricanes.
Yes, they are.
Right. Is there any island or country that is less likely to be impacted by hurricane in those areas that you so clearly defined, the Atlantic Ocean, the Caribbean Sea, and the Gulf of Mexico?
Okay. Thanks for the question, Leslie. Based on the dynamics of a tropical cyclone, it needs spin. And for you to get that level of spin to sustain a tropical cyclone formation, you have to be a certain distance away from the equator. So those countries that are closer to the equator, the chances of impact from a tropical cyclone is less. So these islands, for example, when you look at the Caribbean island chain, we're talking about islands such as Trinidad and Tobago. Those are really impacted by tropical cyclones. Note, we're saying really and not never. Because you can have a degree of spin occurring even at those latitude, and they can be impacted. But the chances of it happening is more for us in the northern leewards. So you recognize, we usually talk about the hurricane belt. The hurricane belt for us in the Caribbean basin, especially you're talking about islands that are from St. Lucia northwards up to us. Those are the islands that are likely to be impacted once something is traversing across the island chain. So we usually pay close attention to, we here in St. Kitts and Nevis go down to south, at least down to at least St. Lucia thereabout.
And so there's a whole disturbance that's taking place. You have that period of time, as you said, between June 1st and November 30th is ripe for the development of hurricanes, because of the warming of the oceans, and you have more convectional activity that is basically taking place.
Yes.
And so therefore, it means then you can have to get more rainfall and all of that sort of thing. Now, how does the hurricane develop, Mr. Burke? How does it develop? What are the stages?
Okay. Thanks for the question. Usually what you would have a cluster of thunderstorm, and once this cluster of thunderstorm starts to develop, and start to develop what we call some spin, then it becomes a bit better organized. And then after that, you would recognize the level of wind speed would start to increase, because the more it spins, the greater the winds would start to increase. And as it gets better organized in terms of developing more and more thunderstorms around a core center, it becomes stronger. And as it gets stronger, the winds get stronger in terms of the magnitude. So that is almost like the domino effect that you would have. So you would go from a cluster of thunderstorms, as I indicated, then you can go into a disturbance, from a disturbance into a tropical depression, then into a tropical storm, into a hurricane, and so forth. However, there are times that, based on the rapid development, you would recognize that although it seems as if it skipped a stage, so for example, you will find a system sometimes go from a disturbance into a storm, because it got so developed in such a short period of time that by the time that they're ready to issue the alerts, we would already call it no longer a disturbance, but now a storm. Because we're looking at a combination in terms of what level of sustained winds does the system have, and is it organized, the level of organization that we will be monitoring as well.
Right. So even though we have this hurricane season with the likelihood of storms becoming hurricanes, we can have storms at any time throughout the year. And so therefore, disaster preparedness is not just around this time. So disaster preparedness is something that is around the clock. We have to prepare for disasters. It's a part and parcel, as they say, of life.
Because just to add to that, Mr. Williams, I know although the focus during the hurricane season is on tropical cyclones, as you rightfully say, you can have tropical cyclone activity happening before, and you can have it happening after the official hurricane season. But at the same time, persons need to recognize that when we're talking about hydrometeorological events, we're not just talking about just the hurricane or the storms, because you can have a trough system, you can have a weather pattern creating sufficient instability, and that we can have significant downpours. Because I remember there was I can't remember the exact date, but we would have had occasions where outside of the hurricane season that you are impacted from a trough. For example, persons can recall clearly, I think it was the Christmas Eve trough that caused significant impact to countries such as St. Vincent and St. Lucia. And that was Christmas time. That was a time that most persons are not even focusing on any kind of significant inclement weather. But you had a trough system coming through and dumping torrential amount of rainfall on the islands and causing deaths as well.
So you don't want people to be caught off guard, so to speak. And if people are caught off guard, it simply means then that there can be more loss to life and to property, and more damage than anything else. So what would you encourage people to do? Because there are some people who they don't pay attention to the weather forecast.
Because of that, it is very important that the general public pay attention to the weather forecast, not just only during hurricane season, but all year round. Because as Ms. Petty would have indicated, you have a range of impacts that can happen. So you can have extreme wet or extreme dry conditions, and the forecast would capture that information. And once we put out the necessary bulletins, along with the agency in terms of disaster agency, The disaster agency will tell you what type of actions or what type of response, I should say, you should take to prevent any loss of life or loss of livelihoods. So it is very important that the public pay close attention to the information that we put out on a daily basis.
Right, so we have some of the impacts, of course. We can have flooding because of the torrential rainfall. And there are certain areas that are more prone to flooding than others. There are certain areas that are more prone to land erosion. Some areas that are more prone, of course, to have impacts from the wind because they don't have a lot of shield and that sort of a thing. So even though we are talking about a disaster, the way that the disaster impacts certain communities and certain people is not equal. And you find that based on a person's situation, we speak about based on how prepared a person is, we're talking about the impact, but also based on where a person lives, based on their resources, based on the resilience of the structures that they have, and all of that can all affect the impact that a disaster can have. And usually, so therefore, there are some people who are more vulnerable to disasters than others. Now, Ms. Petty, that vulnerability, people who are vulnerable or more vulnerable to the impact of disasters, how does NEMA manage that?
So in terms of vulnerability, we look at vulnerability in two ways, based on location and based on certain demographics of an individual or the population on a whole. So NEMA, in collaboration with the NEMA district volunteers as well as social services, we try and keep an updated list of vulnerable persons living within the different districts. And a vulnerable person, we classify that as a person living with disability, the elderly, and to some extent children. What we do at the agency, and we saw that during the response of COVID-19 in 2020, we especially look at those who are living alone and who wouldn't be able to assist themselves. And so what we do, we have the list, we spatially reference them or we plot them on a map so that we can know how heavily intense one area is in terms of the vulnerable persons compared to another, so that we know, okay, so if we have to evacuate persons and this is a vulnerable area, these persons may need additional assistance. And when I speak about vulnerable areas now, depending on the hazard, you have different vulnerability, as you would have mentioned. If we are speaking about hurricanes, for example, you look at the coastal communities. In particular, you look at the Bay Road, you look at New Guinea, Herefordshire, Old Road, because historically, you know that when systems have passed, these are the areas that are impacted from the seaside the most. And so you look at those and you look at, are there vulnerable persons living there, as well as the amount of persons living on these coastal areas. You say to them, we expect that we may have some storms, so some water may come at such a level and you may need to evacuate. You know, we encourage persons to evacuate. Of course, some persons may not decide to evacuate until the last minute. However, we would want to discourage that. You know, if we say that we perceive that this threat is at such a level that you may need to evacuate, we encourage you to evacuate. And if you need assistance, of course, you can always reach out and we would assist in the best way we can.
Right. Now what role does training and education play, the agency, in terms of its role in training and education for disaster preparedness, disaster management on a whole?
So year-round, we make sure that our district volunteers as well as members of the Mitigation Council and the subcommittee chairs are trained in different aspects. For example, one of the trainings that we conduct regularly in collaboration with USAID Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance is shelter and shelter management training. We also make sure that we have a cadre of persons trained in initial damage assessment because, of course, after an impact, you would want to know the level of damage that you would have endured. We also do damage and needs assessment training because, you know, after an impact, one of the things that you hear persons asking for is what's this country's needs list. And so we have persons trained in those areas. We also have different persons trained in different areas of community emergency response team. Our NEMA volunteers, for example, some of them have been trained in that. And so they would be able to, because, you know, once you live in a community, you know the community better than anyone else. And so we depend on our NEMA volunteers a lot for response as well as preparedness efforts. And so we make sure that our NEMA volunteers are trained in different areas and that they have the necessary tools and knowledge to carry out those responsibilities.
Right, so that is extremely important because then you want to develop in the communities an awareness, because awareness is important, to be aware of what is happening around you. It doesn't have to be a hurricane. It could be if you see something that can impact what to do. For example, a fire. Right? So if you realize that a fire has started, you know that a fire can be deadly, and if it spins out of control, it can create a lot of damage and hurt and so on. So people need to know what to do. So when people see things in their communities, disasters taking place, what can they do? Who can they call?
Well, in each community or each district, we have district managers, and we classify the NEMA districts based on the constituency boundaries, as it's easier to remember that way. And so we have, as they have 8 constituencies, we have 8 NEMA districts, and then in Nevis, they use parishes. And so for District 1, for example, which spans from the Southeast Peninsula to Victoria Road East, Mr. Ron Boddy, the district manager there, or Mr. Hester Rollins, the assistant district manager, would be the one that you would first try and contact. And then in District 2, from Victoria Road West to Wigley Avenue East, we have Vincent Foe as the district manager, and then Sydney Bridgewater as the assistant manager. In District 3, we have Damien Weeks and Livingston Huggins. And District 3, of course, is from Wigley Avenue West to Palmetto Point. And then we have District 4 from Challengers to New Guinea, which is headed by Derek Boone and assisted by Corinne Small. And then from Sandy Point to Fig Tree and the surrounding areas, or as persons like to refer to District number 5 as St. Anne's, because, you know, we like to stand alone. We have Travis Douglas as the district manager and Sean Edwards as the assistant manager. And then from Newton Ground to Harris's, which is District 6, Terry Morris and Joseph Richardson. At District 7, Bellevue to Atlas Gut West, Maurice Benjamin and Warren Thompson. And then District 8, Atlas Gus Eats to St. Peter's, Mr. Ralda Claxon and Mrs. Patricia Nurse Clark. And you can find the contact information for these persons on our NEMA Facebook page as well as www.nema.kn.
Right, so because one of the things, of course, is important for people to know what to do. The education must involve not just what to do before the disaster, but what to do during the disaster and after the disaster.
Yes, of course.
Of course, but that is important. So all three are interrelated: before, during, and after. And people need to be aware and to be educated in terms of what to do. And I see we have a map up there. So could you explain that map to me, Eureka?
Okay, so we always say what from point A to point B is District 1, District 2. So we've taken it a step further. We actually created maps of each district to show you where it starts and where it ends, and you can also find these on the NEMA website, of course. And so each district has its own map, and you can also view the districts island-wide as well.
Right, so do you have a map of the vulnerable areas?
We do mapping of the vulnerable areas, of course. I don't have one today to show you, but we do mapping, and we make sure that we update them. For example, when you look at landslides, for example, you know that if a landslide occurs, we always record where it occurred and when it occurred, because you know that one of the things that you look at for vulnerability is historical data. So you know historically that this particular area is susceptible to this particular hazard, and then you also want to look at the time to see if it correlates with a particular time of year.
Right. Now, Mr. Burke, do we do our own forecasting here in the Federation, or where do we get that information from? I do know that there are many apps. We have a lot of apps around that do a lot of forecasting, the Weather Channel and other apps. You can find so many of them. And people have these apps on their phones, can tell you what is happening and so on. Where do we get our forecasting from?
Well, for us here in St. Kitts and Nevis, as well as the Northern Leeward Islands, our forecasting office is located in the Antigua Barbuda Med Services. They have jurisdiction to provide us with the island forecast as well as what we call the airport forecast for these islands. In relation to tropical cyclone development, this is done in consultation with the National Hurricane Center, where they would collaborate and issue the relevant advisories. However, it is important to note that we here in St. Kitts and Nevis have started developing the capacity in-house in terms of having persons trained at the level of a forecaster or a /meteorologist. To date, we have 2 persons in country, and a 3rd person should be coming back over the weekend. So we're actually building the internal capacity of the office to be able to not only interpret the information that is coming out of these regional forecasting offices, but we can now localize it, because what you find happening that is done at the regional forecasting office is almost like you're taking a broad paintbrush and just painting the entire island. However, we here on the ground would be able to localize it. So for example, let's say the Antigua and Barbuda may say a tropical cyclone is expected to impact St. Kitts and Nevis during this particular time, creating significant damage to the western side of the island. And persons may say, well, where's the western side? We now can look at the information that we are looking at, along with, in conjunction with the Antigua Barbuda Service, and said, well, persons living on the areas of Sandy Point to say Bay or so forth, you are more prone in that case. So we can actually localize that information for our purpose. And that is one of the benefits of having a local forecaster in country working at both the Met Office here.
Okay. Right. Good. Now, Mrs. Petty, whenever there is a hurricane or a disaster that is very severe, any disaster, there is something that we call the National Emergency Operations Center. We heard it throughout the pandemic, the COVID-19, the NEOC briefings. What is the NEOC?
The National Emergency Operations Center. Basically, it can be activated. So, as I said, because we're in peacetime, We are currently not activated, although we did activate on some level for the response of COVID-19, and some parts of it did stay semi-activated. Your subcommittee, for example, was one of those that stayed activated, and that your subcommittee would have been the Education, Communication, and Early Warning National Disaster Subcommittee. And so the NEOC members, they are staffed with decision makers. As I said, the Mitigation Council makes up of decision makers, PSs, and directors. And it's the same for the National Emergency Operations Center. So we have chairs of the National Disaster Subcommittees that are ruled by the National Disaster Plan, and we have 10 National Disaster Subcommittees. These are the Welfare, Relief, Supplies, and Shelter Management Subcommittee, Utilities, Transport, Housing and Shelter, as I mentioned, Education, Communication and Early Warning, Foreign Assistance, Environment, Medical and Public Health, Search, Rescue and Initial Clearance, and Damage Assessment and Recovery. And these all play a role in the National Emergency Operations Center. If you would realize, each one touch a different area, a different aspect that would be needed during response and during recovery. We also have in the NEOC, we have the commander as well as the director. And then we also have members from SKNDF, and these also sit on the Search, Rescue and Initial Clearance Subcommittee. And then, although they do not sit in the NEOC, we have members from NGOs such as Red Cross, for example, as well as members of the telecommunications companies who have membership with the Utilities National Disaster Subcommittee. Because, you know, one of the first things that may be impacted is utilities, and one of the first things that we need back up and running is, of course, utilities, because once that's back up and running, it helps in terms of returning to normalcy.
Right. So, good. Mr. Burke, the named storms for the 22 Atlantic hurricane season, they normally name them. How do they name them? And what are the names for this year's Atlantic hurricane season?
Okay, thanks for the question. The names are usually alternated in terms of a male name and then a female name. So for example, for this year, we have Alex being the name storm for the A, Bonnie, Colin, Daniel, Earl, Fiona, Gaston, Hermine, Ian, Julia, Carl, Lisa, Martin, Nicole, Owen, Paula, Richard, Shari, Tobias, Virginie, and Walter. So those are the 21 names that are designated for potential storms this year. However, in the event that these 21 names are exhausted, there are a list of supplementary names. I know a few years ago, we would have gone into one of those hyperactive years where we would have utilized Greek letters. And what we found over time, it was becoming difficult for persons to really assess in terms of and keep track in terms of historical information, in terms of if you're using whether alpha, gamma, and so forth, because persons are not used to using these Greek letters. And as such, the National Hurricane Center opted to utilize a supplementary list going forward. So in the event that we exhaust these 21 names, there's a backup 21 names available to be utilized. Based on the forecast, however, we are not anticipating to utilize all 21 names this year, and we are keeping our fingers crossed that we do not utilize these 21 names.
Right, so this year is forecast to be worse than last year.
This year is forecast to actually be similar to last year.
Similar to last year.
Because we're talking about an above average season. As I indicated earlier, according to the Colorado State University, we are anticipating about 19 storms, 9 of which should develop into hurricanes and 4 may develop into major hurricanes. And when we look at compare that to an average hurricane season, and when we're talking about an average hurricane season, we would have looked at a climatological period. And the new climatological period that we're now looking at is 1991 to 2020. So what we would have done is how many storms on average per year you would have had. And based on that, we estimate that you usually have about 14 storms, 7 of which may develop into hurricanes, and 3 to 4 may develop into major hurricanes. So that is the new average. Once ago, we used to use 12, 6, and 3. But we recognize, as I said earlier, due to climate change, there has been an uptick in terms of tropical cyclone activity. Hence, the overall average has increased in terms of the potential number of storms.
We're going to go to the phone lines with the time that we have left to see if anybody wants to call in and ask about this year's hurricane season. The numbers to call are 466-2666, 662-8674, 767-4765, and 1-239-645-4500. We welcome your calls. Right. Ms. Petty, what are some of the non-governmental organizations, NGOs, that NEMA works with in terms of disaster management?
The main ones that we always work with, of course, would be Red Cross. We also look at the other volunteer groups within the communities because, you know, volunteer groups have the volunteer groups usually do some response activities after an impact, and so of course we would want to involve them in our preparedness actions as well as during response. We also work with some church organizations. We work closely with the Evangelical Association as well as the Christian Council and the Seventh-day Adventist associations.
Right. So you work with churches, you work with the Red Cross, you work along with the chamber?
Of course, the chamber actually sits on a number of these national disaster subcommittees that we would have mentioned because, you know, we don't want to just be civil-minded. We want to be both public and private. We want to touch both public and private in our before, during, and after
and you
activities.
Work along with the telecommunication companies,
yes.
Flow and Digicel.
Flow, Digicel, the cable. We work closely with them. They are actually members as well of some of the national disaster subcommittees. They are a close partner in terms of they are always willing to assist us in getting messaging out, whether preparedness or response messaging. Sometimes you'll even get an SMS saying that there's a storm impacting, and that shows the relationship that we have with them.
Right, so the long and short of it is that disaster management is an all-of-society approach.
Alone, we are a body of, 14 staff members serving the entire population of St. Kitts and Nevis. So you could imagine if we had to do it alone, how much we would actually get done.
Right, so you know, disaster management is everyone's responsibility.
Most definitely, and that's something that we want persons to understand.
Mm-hmm. Right. Now, Mr. Burke, what can you tell us in terms of the people paying attention to the local forecast? Because whenever there is a hurricane or storm, you get a lot of people who suddenly become meteorologists.
Meteorologists.
Yes. And start putting out all kinds of things. And what can that do? When you start putting out these kinds of things, what can it do? What is the seriousness in terms of people putting out their own information? And what can that actually do in terms of, you know, the impact of the disaster?
What I would say is when you have some of these individuals who, as you said, become overnight meteorologists, and meteorology is not science that you can learn overnight. It actually takes a lot of time and effort where you actually have to understand how the atmosphere may respond based on the different dynamics. So it's not something to take lightly. We do appreciate at times the support that some of these social media or these persons who have a great following would think in terms of communicating the information. But what we always try to ask them to do, instead of you putting out what you perceive to be your forecast or just taking somebody's forecast randomly from off the website or off the internet, we always ask you to collaborate with us. We are willing to work with you. Because what we would do, we would verify the information first. We would attempt to localize it. And that's the difference. Because most of these international agencies who would put out weather forecasts, they are focused on a particular area. So for example, a lot of the US weather stations, whenever they are putting out forecasts for the sub-region, they're focusing on potential impact to the U.S. Virgin Islands or Puerto Rico because they are U.S. oriented. Whereas we here in St. Kitts and Nevis, along with our colleagues in Antigua, we would focus on the islands directly in terms of St. Kitts and Nevis or the Northern Leeward Islands. So it's important for you to collaborate, dialogue with us so that you can get that localized context. It's not a bad thing if you want to alert persons that there's a potential of something coming, but before you do disseminate that information, it's advisable for you to verify first. After you have verified it with us as the competent authority, then you can disseminate to say, hey guys, we are monitoring something, expect additional information coming from the Met Office, and we always in a state of monitoring. So once we have that information and we deem it a threat to us here in St. Kitts and Nevis, we would alert the general public in a timely manner. Yes, so at times there may be a delay because, you know, there's this old adage, first out the blocks doesn't mean you would win the race. Because I always remember in terms of the tortoise and the hare. And the hare was quick, but lost the race. So it's not always about who can get out the blocks first. We want to make sure that the information that we at the Met Office is putting out is accurate, reliable, and as much as possible, localized. And yes, it may take us a little longer, but that is what we're trying to do. We're trying to package it so that when you get that information, you know what potential impact it may happen to you in your local context and not on a large scale in terms of a sub-regional scale.
Now, Ms. Petty, tell us something about, I've heard that you're having some Finding Trivia edition up at NEMA. Could you tell me something about it? Finding Nemo Trivia Edition. My apologies.
Fine. So we actually started Finding Nemo in 2021 during the month of International Disaster Risk Reduction. And so, you know, it was successful. Person said they had fun. And we did a scavenger hunt at the time, a virtual scavenger hunt, where we had persons complete tasks and send us in video form them completing the task. And persons said, you know, I want to do this again. So we decided, as a part of preparation for the hurricane season, why not make it fun? And so that's how we came up with the trivia contest. So we said, let's do a Finding Nemo Trivia Edition. And so basically from next week until the end of June, we'll be posting historical photographs of past hurricane events that would have damaged some noticeable buildings, noticeable areas, and we'll be having the public guests which event damaged the particular area and what the area is, because some of these photographs you have to actually take a second look to see, because there may have been some changes done in recent years. And so what we'll be doing is, after each week, the end of each week, we'll choose a winner who would have guessed the most for that week, and they would have the opportunity to win a prize. And so we'll have 4 winners at the end of it.
Okay. Right. So people are invited to sign up. I don't know if you sign up or you register. How?
So for this one, we won't be doing any sign up. You just go on our SKN Facebook page daily. You look out for the trivia, you comment, and the first person that comments the right answer would be the winner.
Okay. So there is no signing up or anything like that. It's just on the Facebook page.
Yeah.
And you go and you answer.
Yes. So
Yeah.
as one of the reasons we decided to do this is that over the years we've become complacent. When we hear hurricane season, we've said, I've had persons say, I always saying that something coming but nothing comes, or this or that. And so we decided, why not have persons remember how St. Kitts and Nevis would have been impacted in the past by showing them past images of these damages, the potential devastation that hurricanes can have on our island, so it can be fresh in their memory, so that they can say, yes, when there's a hurricane coming, this is what can potentially happen. So, but we wanted to do it in a fun, engaging way, so we decided that this may be the best way to do it.
We're really out of time. It's almost 3 o'clock. And so if there's anything that you want to say, Ms. Petty, before we go, what are some of the things that you would like people to do to prepare for the hurricane season?
Well, if you haven't started preparing as yet, now is the time to do so. Stock up on your non-perishable food items. You check your house. If you have a business, you also make sure that your business have plans in place that would protect you as well, and get you back up and running as soon as possible after an impact. Because as what's the popular saying, if you fail to prepare, you prepare to fail. We do not want that in St. Kitts and Nevis.
So prevention is worth a pound of cure. Mr. Burke?
Just to add to what Oraika would have said, I just want to encourage the general public to pay close attention to the information that the St. Kitts and Nevis Met Services would be issuing as it relates to potential weather features. We are continuously going to be monitoring weather situation across the Atlantic, and any potential system that may impact us, we will provide that general information in a timely manner so that you can take the necessary action.
Right, and thank you so much. But one of the things that we didn't mention is that of prayer. Of course, we continue to pray for protection for the Federation, St. Kitts and Nevis, and of course the entire Caribbean region at this time. Of course, we know that prayer is, not can be, very powerful, because God is the one that is in control. He's in control of the seas. He's in control of the entire creation. And so therefore, we continue to pray for his protection of the Federation and so on. And so there is a church service this afternoon to begin the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season, service to pray for protection. And that is going to be at the Pentecostal Church of God on Boone Avenue in Bastille at 4:30 p.m. And everyone is invited to come out and to join in prayer and petition as we enter into the 2022 Atlantic hurricane season. Thank you so much, Mrs. Petty, and thank you very much, Mr. Burke, for coming and sharing today about the Atlantic hurricane season and how important it is to prepare ourselves so that the impact of any hurricane during this time will be reduced by our preparation. Thank you very much. I want to thank all of our listeners to today's program. Thank you very much for joining us today. Next week we will be back with another Working for You program. Until then, I am Les Roy Williams. Take good care.
There you had it, folks, on our edition of Working for You here on WinFM 98.9. It's 2 minutes past the hour of 3 o'clock. Up next, we got conscious business.
WINN is 98.9. 98.9 is